Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Zoda's Revenge, StarTropics 2, brought to us by Nintendo. From the same creators as the original StarTropics, but released about 5 years after the original, StarTropics 2 was marking the end of the NES era. Coinciding with this, the Nintendo of North America was working on publishing Zoda's Revenge, Warrior's Woods, and Mega Man 6 together in order to promote the new top-loading NES console, the NES 101. But unfortunately, since the game was released in 1994, the last year of life for the NES, Zoda's Revenge was lost to many gamers. Most gamers had moved on at that point to Nintendo's new console, the Super Nintendo. It wouldn't be till years later that many gamers and even fans of the original got their hands on StarTropics 2, Zoda's Revenge. The only question then was this a hidden gem that not many got to experience? Or did this damage the reputation of the original StarTropics? So here we go with StarTropics 2, Zoda's Revenge for the NES. When you start the game, you get a nice looking title screen, not as memorable as the original by any means though, and then after a few seconds, you get the basic storyline after you see the Oxford Wonder World open up. After retelling the story of StarTropics 1 to get everybody back familiar with the game, we then go back to our main screen where we start up, and just like the original, we get to enter our name, just like other classic NES games like Zelda. We then start with chapter number 1. Just like the first StarTropics game, it is broken up into multiple different chapters. The first one, though, is all story. So as you can see, we're not on the tropical islands. Instead, we actually are traveling through space and time inside of the Oxford Wonder World book that Dr. J had. The beginning of the chapters pretty much all will begin with the chapter that we're in, and that we slip into another time and space. We then come to the overworld style map, and just like StarTropics 1, the game is broken up into two modes, the overworld and the dungeon maps. When we start off here, you can kind of see we're already in an ice age with cavemen. We then come to a weird patch that's all dotted along the ground, and there's tons of holes here that lead to little mini dungeons. Following the path I do though, we avoid those mini dungeons and instead go right into the main cave, which is basically the village for the caveman world. Once inside here, you can talk to the civilians, but unlike StarTropics 1, and one of the big improvements is you don't need to talk to everyone in order to do story progression. Walk over here and talk to this guy to get our first weapon of the game. Now immediately, some people are taken back by this. You end up getting a throwing axe as your main weapon instead of the yo-yo. All the weapons that you use in the game are throwing-based weapons. You don't use a standard sword-like weapon, even though you end up getting daggers and even later a katana. Instead, you just have an unlimited supply of weapon that you can just keep throwing out over and over again. Fans of the original usually are pretty mixed on this, whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing to the game. Also, with having throwing weapons as well as another attack that we'll get later on, it kind of starts negating the point of the sub-weapons that we were able to collect in the original StarTropics. After leaving the village, after talking to the village elder, we then head to the cave just north, and it's time to begin the first dungeon of the game. Here you can see that the basic look and feel is still very much intact. But one thing you'll easily notice is you have a lot more freedom of movement. Mike can now move in all different directions. He can change directions mid-jump, and this adds a huge diversity to the game. Immediately though, some players love the classic feel of being just strictly on the grid, while others thought that this really kind of moved the platforming and other elements of the game forward, making it a little bit more accessible. Honestly though, the whole system has its positives and its negatives. The first StarTropics was really based around the grid system. In this one, with more freedom of movement, you'll have an opportunity to move around a lot more, save yourself from death sometimes, but also cause yourself a few unnecessary deaths by just barely hitting the edge of a puddle of water. And of course, in the original game, since it was all grid-based, you never worried whether you were or weren't gonna safely land your next jump. You already knew what was gonna happen. This adds, while making some things easier, definitely makes some parts a bit challenging. For example, right here. We can either go all the way around a safe way dealing with all the abominable snowmen-like enemies, or we can take a shortcut going diagonally along these other jumps. It's a good idea to actually do this little side path because you get used to the jumping mechanics pretty early on. Getting used to them will help you actually take shortcuts and bypass areas later on in the game. As for your other controls, attacking works pretty easily. Just like you would throw one of the sub-weapons in the original, you just keep throwing the tomahawk-like axes over and over again. Your health meter is represented in the lower right, but you actually start with 5 hearts. Below that is the jar meter, how many little mini jars you have, the stars, which just like the original, collect 5 and you get some hearts, and of course your lives. During this segment, you have to follow a strict pattern of the symbols. If you're wondering where the code for this was, it was actually located in the cave where the village was. North of where the village chief sits, this was actually painted along the wall. You would have to usually write it down or memorize it before entering the dungeon to know where you're going. I remember quite vividly as a kid writing it down in the manual for the game that it came with in order to make sure I knew which path to take. If you accidentally take a wrong path, you end up exiting out and have to redo the area. Now here's our first boss of the game, Yum Yum, and man is he easy. He's extremely fat and he loves to eat, so for almost the entire length of the battle, I just stand there and keep smacking him with the tomahawks. As soon as he finally gets done eating his last meal, he's already taken care of. Now we will rematch this guy much later in the game, and he doesn't eat the warthog during that part. If you accidentally kill the warthog first instead of attacking him, he gets quite angry and starts attacking you quicker than he normally would. Also, he shoots bubbles out. All the pattern is moving back and forth, firing bubbles that you're easily able to jump around. The bubbles themselves only do about half a heart worth of damage, so you should have plenty of health to take out Yum Yum. After doing so, you save the village children and pick up this weird rock that we soon find out is the main purpose of StarTropics 2. After the dialogue with the special block, we now just work our way around and exit out, and then we are contacted once again by Mika. I love the reaction of Mike when he finally realizes that he has the tetrad, and then it actually does two things of changing. Oh, you now have a tetrad instead of just a block. You also increase your health every time you get one of the tetrads in the game, but there's also a few hidden hearts to find as well, just like the original. At the end of each chapter, basically, we travel through time and space, usually through the book, in order to land in another area. For example, now, we are in ancient Egypt. Except, this has definitely changed around a little bit. Well, of course, the game originally had kind of humorous tones to a lot of things. StarTropics 2 really took the humor to another level, having it very silly at times and over the top. At the beginning of the Egyptian area, we board this giant boat, and we get to talk to a few people before entering inside the boat in order to talk to Cleopatra herself. Cleopatra informs us that she's actually waiting for a pizza of all things, and it's taking days and days to get here. So, your goal now, in order to get the next tetrad piece, is to first get Cleopatra's pizza. So you head north of where the boat was located, talk to this guy who will now move, since he knows you're going to get Cleopatra's pizza, and work your way around in order to enter the first dungeon. A couple of chapters in the game only have one dungeon, but a lot of them will basically have an A and a B dungeon for you to explore. This is the first of the two dungeons in chapter number 3. In the first room here, we have some spider enemies. They take a couple of hits to get rid of. They move really slow, and they fire out projectiles, but once again, it moves at a slug's pace, and you're able to easily dodge it. The next room, though, has this guy who will try to stab at you. He's very big, of course, he'll do a good amount of damage to you, but he's actually very similar to the bear enemies we saw in the first dungeon of the game. Just keep your distance away from guys like that in the game, and just keep launching projectiles. When we get better moves that can go a little bit farther, enemies of that size really aren't too much trouble in this one. The porcupine enemies located here will eventually start spinning around and trying to move around the room. Just watch out, as you won't be able to hit them while they're spinning, but a couple of hits and they're gone. Just like you pretty much can guess from the formula that StarTropics works at, once you're introduced to a singular big enemy, chances are in a room or two later, you're going to be fighting multiple of them, in this case, 3 of these big green guys. Just keep your distance. They do move a little bit faster than some of the other enemies here, but they aren't too bad. The scorpion enemies are pretty much the exact same as the spider enemies, except you don't see any projectiles from these guys. And also, with the floor broken up the way it is, it actually allows you to traverse it pretty easily, and also keeps the scorpions kind of locked in small areas. Here you have some enemies that actually just move along the ground, and eventually their eyes start peering at you. They really aren't a threat though, because you can clearly see where they are in the ground still, so just a couple of hits, they're gone. Here you have to work your way around the left side of the room, then climb all the way up, and then make a big jump over the large gap in the middle area by the door. Of course, if you try to make that jump naturally, you'll just end up falling in the pit, since once again you can only clear one square at a time with your jumping in the game. And unlike the original StarTropics, there is actually no feather item to help you increase that jump power. I can just imagine what that would be like in this game with the added ability of moving in all directions. You can jump a large amount of distance. Here, it's time for the next boss fight. Hopefully you've gotten used to the little scorpions by now, because there's going to be 4 of them at a time during this boss fight summoning from the walls, along with the giant scorpion himself that every so often will start moving his tail quickly, his claws start moving, and he fires out a whole string of projectiles. Now the projectiles cover a good amount of distance, but you can usually jump over them or get in between them if you're far enough away from the boss. Even if you hang in really close to this guy, the projectiles won't do too much damage, just don't let him actually run into you. And after a good amount of hits, you'll defeat him, and we end up outside of the dungeon itself, and we can go over here to the right after racking up our score and actually rent a camel to go deep into the desert to find that missing pizza. After getting the pizza item in your inventory, you can see the turtle guy all of a sudden really speeds off as he's trying to get away from you. And then you run, hurry, just like you did sometimes in the original StarTropics, right back to Cleopatra's giant boat and deliver that pizza to her. And she, of course, quickly scarfs it all down. You gotta love the fact that the pizza place is called Caesar's Hut, as you saw as all the slices were eaten from the box itself. Then, the ship takes off to the opposite side of the Egyptian stage, and now we land safely on the other island. Cleopatra also gives us an upgrade to our weapon, giving us the dagger ability. This is the second of the 3 sword-like items that we end up getting in the game. Interestingly though, we end up getting another weapon before we actually do the next big dungeon. But before we can go there, we have to travel north into probably one of my least favorite areas in the game. This giant hedge maze, as you chase a monkey around, reminds me of Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, just a little bit. I know, another StarTropics, and I'm making a ton of Zelda references. But the game makes it kinda easy to do so. Anyway, the gimmick here is to work around the actual hedge maze. When you're walking around though, you can't see where you're going while you're in the actual maze itself, unless you climb up. If you climb up to one of the platforms, you can actually see the entire maze without the grass covering it, showing you which way you can actually walk. Along the way, there are different pits that you have to travel in and do these little short mini dungeons, like this one right here, fighting some alligators and some killer ducks that will actually fire projectiles out of you. You have to defeat the alligators during this scene to make it to the next room. After a few rooms of traveling through here, which actually kinda reminds me of some of the regular dungeons from the original game. Here we take out some jellyfish, as well as avoid a giant hippo before we get to the end of this little area. Our goal is to catch the monkey and make it to the end of the maze. As you can see, after we make it past that little mini dungeon, the monkey runs off once again. If we climbed up the ladder there up to the platform, we could see the hedge maze out in front of us. The first time going through the game, you'll probably want to do that and actually either mentally or actually write a map. Draw it down so you kind of get an idea of how the maze is set up. Or of course you can look up for a picture online. Here, instead of going right where I need to, I travel over here to the right to grab the first extra big heart of the game. It increases our health meter by 1 and completely replenishes our health as well. Now, right back into the maze itself. Running into dead ends constantly is a theme, but with a little bit of knowledge and practice, you can actually poke and prod your way through this thing. Eventually you'll pop out here, and once you do so, back down to the depths below to have another dungeon. This one is pretty much the exact same style as the last one. You'll have some alligators and some killer ducks along the way. While this doesn't really count as a full-blown dungeon in the game, I guess Egypt actually ends up being one of the longer chapters in the game. It's just kind of weird that both StarTropics 1 and 2, the third chapter of the game, is the longest by far. In order to get the next door to open, take out the frog enemies, once again avoiding the large hippo, which is kind of like the Mudman in StarTropics 1. Next up, there's a ton of jellyfish and a little frog jumping along the middle, but you can ignore them as the door is already open at the top part. Here, you can't go straight and jump, instead you have to go to the sides and jump over the water so that you have a clear way to get to the exit without accidentally drowning yourself. Once you pop out, the monkey shows up again, taunting us as we go back inside the maze. Thankfully though, we don't have too much farther to travel through this area before we're finally out. And if you're able to get past this part, this is probably the most frustrating aspect of this game. and one of the few areas that I always kind of dread playing the game over for. After what seems like forever, we finally escape. We pop out of the area itself, and we're right by a mountain range of all things. The monkey ends up showing up and talking to us, and then gives us the psychic shockwave ability. Yeah, a monkey randomly gives us the psychic shockwave ability. You can bet there's more to that we'll see later on in the game. He also, thankfully, teleports us right near the entrance to the next dungeon, the actual pyramid dungeon. Now we have the ability to break the force field. You could actually travel here earlier on before doing the hedge maze, but without the psychic shock wave, you wouldn't have been able to get rid of the force field. Now, you want to use the dagger and the shock wave to help you out throughout the dungeon. There's actually a few enemies in the game that can only be destroyed by the shock wave. The shock wave is usually a tad bit weaker than the dagger, at least leading up to the final one in the game. The advantage to it, though, is it can fire a lot faster than the other weapons in the game. You're able to multi-hit an enemy a lot quicker than you would be able to with your dagger, axe, or later on the other weapons you get. Here's an example of an enemy that can only be destroyed with the psychic wave, so make sure that you select it and then attack the enemies. Pressing the select button is how you change between the sword and the psychic wave, just like you did in the first game. One of the enemies I love are the little tiny mummies, reminding me of the Michelin Man. But then when I really think about it, since they're small mummies, and the mummies are obviously mummies of dead humans, I don't necessarily want to think of child mummies. Though, there are a few Egyptians that did die quite young and were mummified. Here you have to take out both the snake and the other creature in order to open up the door to the right. The skeletons here with the cloaks cannot actually be destroyed. You can hit them a few times, they'll fall apart, but after a few seconds they'll rebuild themselves and continue. Thankfully, there is no time in the game where you have to actually kill these guys. There's no way that I know of in order to defeat them all the way. Hit the switch on the top portion, and then hit the question mark ball on the bottom, and the door on the right side will open up. Here, start off by immediately attacking the large mummy. Then, from afar, you can take out the small little enemies if you want to, before jumping into the main center of the room and taking out the mummy on the far right. Also in the upper right corner is another Mike sign with Mike's face on it. This is just like the ones from StarTropics 1, where you pretty much gamble for an extra amount of lives. Each time you pick it up, though, is completely random how many extra lives you'll end up getting, 1 or 2, or end up losing a life. These enemies that resemble the Egyptian god Horus move pretty quick. They fire out some projectiles, so these are a little bit more of the deadlier enemies in this area. The next room, though, has a whole bunch of arrows. You'll have to get used to these arrow panels in the game. We've seen a few already, but they push and pull you whatever direction they end up showing, and there's a lot of them in the game. In this room, what you have to do is actually use the arrows to move all around and take out all the scorpions located on platforms surrounded by all the spikes around the room. If you're able to destroy each one of the scorpions, the door will finally open up. Here, you can hit this switch in the middle to grab a couple extra hearts before opening up the door on the left and going through. A couple of the little mummies and the psychic shockwave only enemies, and another door will pop open. Here, though, you have a pretty cool area. You have a giant snake that you can see kind of drawn into the ground with all the little panels. At first, though, we can't do anything in this room, but we're actually going to have to come back to this room in just a little bit. Open up the switch to the room next to it, couple of big mummies, nothing too bad, and then move into the next room. Here you'll have a Horus as well as a bunch of these 4 panels set up with fire that erupts from the middle. Just ignore them and head south. Next room, lots of little mummies, but your main goal is opening up the chest and grabbing the flute item. This is the only time in the game that the flute item comes into effect, but you must have it. Now backtrack to the snake room. Use the flute item and you'll end up summoning snakes from the walls. Defeating these snakes now will open up the entrance to allow us to continue on in the level. While nothing really that cryptic, still one of the cooler moments of the game. Here you can really ignore the enemies if you want to. Our goal is to jump on the giant squares in the middle. These types of squares you'll see a lot. When you jump on them, another square will immediately appear. You have to do them in the right order a lot of times in order to be able to safely cross areas. Next room though is time for the boss. This giant head of a pharaoh which has some really weird things. It fires normal projectiles, but all of a sudden he'll flip to a really scary looking face and blast giant lasers at you. Use either the dagger or the psychic shockwave. I usually prefer the shockwave because it hits a lot quicker. This way I can hit the enemy multiple times even when I'm being pulled backwards by the arrows in the floor. Of course you want to make sure that you absolutely avoid getting hit directly by the giant lasers he fires straight out at you. Keep hitting him with the psych wave, he'll turn red eventually when he gets really weak, and then has only a few more hits to go before you beat him. After racking up the score and saving the game, just move forward, grab the tetrad, and move on to chapter number 4. We jump from ancient Egypt all the way to a closer to present day London, as we're actually near Baker Street. We of course meet the very famous and fictional character Sherlock Holmes just a few seconds later as we enter the first house. Sherlock informs us that something or someone will be stealing something precious from the museum tonight. We are then moved to another part of the town. You can bypass the first open door that you end up seeing and go in front of the police station, walking down just a little bit and then around the next building. As you go around here, you'll see a policeman standing in the middle of the street. Talk to him. He'll say that, it's a little late to go to the museum, might as well arrest you, and throws you in jail. Thankfully, the jail has an easily accessible breakable wall right by us, and we can just go right through that, and it seems to put us actually right near the museum that we actually were trying to get to in the first place. I love the sleepwalking person that's actually walking back and forth right outside that exit between the buildings. As we head straight up north, we go to the museum and run into Sherlock once again. After seeing the tetrad stolen by Zoda, and Holmes giving us his famous "the game's afoot" line, we are then back in the middle of the streets. There's two open sewers here, one that leads to the next dungeon, and the other one, the one up here, leading to the next big heart that you're able to find. Thankfully we don't have to increase our health too much, as we haven't lost any health at this point in the level, and then we'll head to the actual sewer and begin the first of two dungeons located here in London. As you begin, you have to make a short jump over the water, and to the next scene. There is a log raft moving back and forth. Now, the log raft does not have invisible walls on it. If you walk off of it, you will lose a life by falling into the water, so be very careful while traveling on it. Next up, pretty simple room, but there's multiple exits. The one that we first won is actually located over to the right. Jump along the blocks watching out for the jellyfish, and then go north. Here you'll have some rat enemies and slime enemies. You have to take them all out to open up the door. In the next room, you have frogs moving back and forth, but you don't really have to worry about the frogs if you don't want to, though taking them out will just allow you to progress a little bit easier. You'll then pop out back into this main room, head over to the right, and open up the door by hitting the switches. You can now jump down here in order to continue the dungeon. Our goal for this whole area is that door open all the way over to the left, but we have to go along this winding path taking out some rats in order to get to that open door. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this game was made by the same team that made the original StarTropics. Interestingly enough though, this game did not see a European release like the original did. Well, not until the Virtual Console for the Nintendo Wii, where it was finally brought to Europe, but never has been brought to Japan. Neither StarTropics 1 or 2 was ever released, even including Virtual Console versions. And to give some time perspective, at the same time they were developing this game, the team was also working on Super Punch-Out for the Super Nintendo. After taking care of some owl enemies in this room, we move to the boss. Here we see Zoda summoning up a blob of some sort. He ends up launching out little aliens similar to the ones we saw at the end of StarTropics 1. For this boss battle, use the shockwave as you'll be able to hit him a little bit easier and be able to shoot it quicker, because you'll have to shoot quick in order to hit this thing. What you have to do is jump back and forth between all the squares. When you land on one, just like in other areas, it'll make another one appear. You have to keep doing this as you work your way around the giant blob, attacking it over and over again. Once the blob's destroyed though, you have to jump to the platform it was on in order to activate the door on the right side. After exiting out of the dungeon, and even before our score racks up, we get to see Zoda take off to a farther part of the sewer system. So, of course, we're going to be heading right after him. After passing by some water, you see some mysterious footprint of Zoda himself on the ground, and then we go into the actual next dungeon. Could it be that Zoda is actually going to be taken out pretty early on this game? I wouldn't necessarily count on that. First up in the next room, we have to battle some of the little tiny Zoda offsprings that shoot out. After that, we have giant rats. These rats not only are huge, but they walk on two legs and try to stab you with their very spiky tail. They work the same though as the bat enemies and the guys that were green-skinned in the Egyptian levels. They're big, they're bulky, they move rather slowly, but they can pack a massive punch if you're not careful. Here, just hit the switch. You can take out the enemies to open up the door below, but we don't need to travel down there. Instead, you want to travel over to the left. Be careful on the arrows in this room that they don't accidentally push you right off into the water, because there's no invisible walls at the end of any of the arrows, and you can instantly lose a life that way. Here, you'll just have to jump back and forth a few times. Really just felt they were kind of, padding this room a little bit too much by having to jump back and forth over and over. The next room has a couple of weird little aliens that will move around firing projectiles. You'll see these guys a few times throughout the game, but they're not too bad. In this room, what you want to do is, instead of actually hitting any of the switches, you want to walk in between the set of blocks to the bottom. You'll fall through and land safely on the center platform here, and this will allow you to continue on in the dungeon. The next room, there's a bunch of rats, but they're separated into 3 separate areas, so they're easy to manage. In the next room, you have 2 more of those weird floating green aliens. They will fire projectiles, but like I said, they aren't too bad. Here, you can choose to stay on the raft a little bit and head over to the left side if you want to grab an extra life or 2, or lose some, or grab some extra health if you do need it. Or you can just stay on the raft and wait for it to slowly move across so you can jump to the next raft. And I recommend jumping. Don't try to walk between the 2 rafts, as I always found that difficult, and I usually would end up just falling through. If you want to grab the chest, you can, but for the most part we're just going to ignore it and head over to the left. But you have to make sure that you see the raft on screen that's coming from the left, because if you go too soon, this block will end up falling once you land on it. You can tell we're getting pretty close to Zoda as we have some more of his offspring running around this room. After they've all been defeated, instead of actually going to the right, you want to hit this lower right square and then go to the left to enter the boss fight. Here we battle, well, Zoda, on a giant platform filled with arrows pushing you all kinds of different directions. Zoda has two basic moves here. He teleports and reappears all around the room, but when he appears, he'll either trap you in a up to 4 flame set, where you'll be stuck in the middle trying to avoid taking damage, or he'll launch out a whole series of skull-like projectiles in your direction. Either the dagger or the psychic shockwave, whichever one you prefer to use here. Once again, I'm using the shockwave because I can hit him a little bit quicker. And with the poor mobility in this room, I want to be able to fire off as many shots as quickly as I can, to just sometimes barely clip them as I'm moving by. This fight is definitely the toughest boss so far, but thankfully there's no instant deaths on the wall, so you don't have to worry about that. The worst area that really you can do though is getting stuck really close to him, and then magnify that with the flames around you. If you run into him or the flames, they do a good amount of damage. After you defeat him, you'll see him kind of transform into the wheeled alien-like thing we saw at the end of StarTropics 1, Zoda's true form, and then we exit out of the dungeon itself. After a nice little save and score rack up, just move around the rest of the sewer, grab the tetrad, and you've completed chapter number 4. As we found out, we're actually battling Zoda X, and Zoda Y and Zoda Z are still out there trying to stop us from collecting the tetrad, so our journey is far from over. After talking to Sherlock one last time, we blast off through another time and space and land in the desert of chapter number 5. Now, chapter 5 is a Wild West setting, definitely one of my favorite settings. When you enter the main town, our goal is to actually talk to a guy located at the very top, but we're going to stop by the saloon first. Now, stopping by the saloon is completely optional. I love the two guys brawling in the bottom. You can have a shot of Sarsaparilla over on the left side here. You can also get another shot here by talking to the guy at the center table. Taking a shot of red-eyed ginger ale ends up making the scream flash as you scream dynamite. Talk to the guy on the right side, the composer here, and he'll play his greatest hit for you. The dancers on stage will go to a more modern outfit and start dancing around. The lyrics, though, that this guy tells you is actually the hint to find out where you need to go. Following the moves exactly of the cactus dance, you'll be able to make it and open up the right hole in the wall coming up in just a little bit. After listening to the cactus dance, and another one of my favorite moments of the game, we can exit out of the saloon, head back to the center of town, and head north again. Once we keep heading north, you want to enter this house on the far right. North of here is a cemetery that has some pretty funny gravestones, so if you're looking for another little laugh, definitely check out them. Talking to this guy in here, you give him the old spiel of what you're looking for and all that. And he lets you know a little bit of a secret about it, and that there's a mine that was buried by a landslide. We combine that with what we learned from the cactus dance, and now we kind of have an idea of what we're doing here in Chapter 5. After talking to this guy, exit out and go to the first open door in the town, which is the shop. If you try to go to the shop earlier on, he'll say that he's closed and he won't help you out. You have to talk to at least that guy that I just did in order to enter Bob's store and grab the dynamite. We end up getting a load of dynamite. Now, we're actually going to have to get 2 loads of dynamite, but we can only have 1 at a time. The first one that we're going to be using will allow us to get another one of the giant hearts. Head outside of the town and head left into the big open area. Just head straight over, and then head south all the way down near the very bottom. You'll see 2 giant rocks sticking out. In between them, plant the first stick of dynamite. It'll explode the wall, and inside you'll find a giant heart. Now, you can actually blow up almost every spot along this mountain, one of which will lead to the mines that we need to travel to, some will lead to nothing, and another one will lead to a gold nugget. Well, it's not really a gold nugget, it's a chicken nugget of all things. Yes, a chicken nugget located in a mountain wall in the Wild West. But it is there, and either way, you can eat it, but nothing will end up happening, and why you would want to eat it, I have no idea. Either way, after we've gotten the big heart, we're going back to Bob's store and grabbing another stick of dynamite. Now, I'm not going to show the exact step-by-step thing for the cactus dance. Instead, I'm just going to go right to where the cactus is located and then head over. Exit out of the town itself and head south. You'll see a cactus that the arms of the cactus are facing differently. The cactus right above it, you want to be facing it directly from the right side, and then go straight from it all the way into the mountain. Blast it open, and that's where you need to go in order to continue on here in StarTropics. Enter the cave at the very end, and it's time to enter the first of 2 dungeons here in Chapter 5. The first enemies we're introduced here are scorpion enemies. They fire out projectiles 2 at a time that come out in a line, so they take up a little bit more space, and they move a little bit quicker than some of the other ones we've seen. The next room, watch out for the cactus guys. Yes, literally guys made of cactus. And then open up the wall by actually attacking it. It'll open up a hole that allows you to go through, and there'll be a staircase inside. The staircase does not thankfully take us out of the dungeon, but instead allows us to continue. After going through the next room, immediately jump into the center of the next area and you'll fall through the floor down to this floor below. Here, take out a couple more of the cactus enemies. When you attack an enemy that looks like this in the game, and there's a few of them, some golem, in this case the cactus guys, they end up turning red after a few hits and then explode into a projectile shot. Be careful of this projectile, you can easily jump over it, but you always have to be wary, especially when you fight multiples of that enemy at the same time. Now in this room, you can take out the treasure chest using the psychic shockwave. This way the treasure chests won't explode the way they do, and end up breaking up into little coins that go everywhere. But since there's only 4 chests here, I just take them out with a dagger. After one more room, it's time for the actual boss here. This guy is similar to an enemy we saw earlier, except now he's gray instead of green. Now if you walk into him, it's an instant death. What he does is he brings this rock up and down, back and forth a few times, and then eventually kicks it in your direction. You can jump over it and continue to attacking him. Of course, if you accidentally attack the rock instead of him, it won't do any damage. Now, if he gets too close to the right wall, you'll run out of space to go and he'll end up killing you, but you should have more than enough time to deliver enough hits to defeat him before he gets even close to that door on the right where you entered from. Once he's done, the blocks appear so you can safely exit out of that room, and then you end up running into a mysterious donkey that's just kind of waiting in the middle of this hallway. After a little dialogue, he upgrades your shockwave to the super psychic shockwave. He then mysteriously disappears. Definitely wonder what's going on with that. Either way, we now have a new ability. The super psychic shockwave does of course more damage, and it travels farther than the previous one. But like the main weapon from StarTropics 1, when you get below a certain amount of hearts, it reverts. And this will go again for when we get the final version of the shockwave later on. In this room, immediately jump over to the right, off of the giant moving conveyor belt of arrows, and grab the magic jar so you have a failsafe to pick up some extra health. Here, after one more room, just jump over to the left to get to where these scorpions are located. If you go all the way straight up, you'll end up falling through the floor, as you can see below in that little enclosed area. That's all hole there, and you'll just fall through and have to work your way back around. Instead, by jumping over to the left where the scorpions are, we can move around the outside border, watching out for cactus enemies, and go all the way around and down into here. Here we said some more of those treasure chests earlier, and as you can see, with the psychic shockwave, they don't break open into the coins and start going everywhere. Here in the next room, you have arrows all around in 3 different levels. If you want another one of the magic jars, open up the wall to the top, go through the now exposed wall, and in order to grab another one of the magic jars, and then go back here. Here you'll have to jump back and forth between the platforms to avoid the rocks. You'll have to go over to the very bottom here in order to grab this star item that's up in the upper corner. Now this is the only time we end up getting the star in this game, and what it does is it makes you invincible for a period of time. I'm not even going to really end up using the item. It makes you solid white, similar to using the clock stop ability in the first StarTropics game that froze enemies. After another set of cactus enemies, we go to kind of a mini-boss. This minecart is going pretty wild with the skeleton inside of it, and he also throws out little gold guys. These guys are the same as the giant and small mummies that we saw in the Egyptian levels. The minecart keeps going back and forth on either track. It's random which track he decides to pick from, and he fires projectiles the whole time. I have a really hard time not taking at least 3 or 4 hits of damage usually each time I end up fighting that guy. If I end up getting low on health, that's the reason why I end up picking up the magic jars, so I could refill my health and make sure that I kept the super psychic shockwave available to me. In this room, you can ignore the killer miners that just keep randomly appearing. The ghost miners really aren't too much of a threat, and they're actually exactly the same enemy we saw in StarTropics 1, the ghost enemies that we had to actually reflect back at them. This time though, you don't have to worry about that. This room, be very, very careful in this hallway. Wait for the opening and then quickly move through to avoid getting hit by all the spikes. Thankfully they give you a couple of hearts, but right after that, it's boss time. Here we face off with a giant skeleton killer miner. This guy will pound the ground, freezing us in place if you're standing on the ground when he hits it. There's no way to avoid at least shaking for a few seconds, even when you jump and time it perfectly. He causes rocks to appear and start moving around that can damage you, as well as when he hits the ground, projectiles go everywhere. Your goal is to stay a decent amount of distance away from him and just keep hitting him over and over again with the super shockwave. You want to keep your also distance from as many of the little rocks as you can, because they will actually block your shots. The path he moves is random, so you'll have to be careful when maneuvering around. It's best not to get ganged up by him and the rocks, instead wait for the best opportunities to deliver hits. Once he's done, move through the next hallway after the save and grab the next tetrad as we move on to the next chapter. Next up, well, we're in another town-type setting similar to where we were in London earlier, except this time we're in the Renaissance period in Italy. There's some citizens here you can talk to that will clue you in on what exactly is going on and what time period you're in, but you don't really have to worry about them. Instead, travel around and go across this large bridge. Once across the bridge, you can check out the scenery of the nice fountains and all the water flowing over and underneath the bridges themselves. Over at this section of the town, head south and enter inside the open door. Inside here, you see a weird figure that's kind of been stuck in cement-like substance, as well as the familiar footprints we first saw earlier on in the sewer area of London. I wonder if Zoda has been here. After noticing the person stuck inside the cement, head over to the left and go down the staircase. Now this is one of my favorite dungeons in the game. There's no enemies to fight. That's correct, no enemies for you to fight. It's all based around pitfalls and puzzles that you have to maneuver around. There's a bunch of tough jumping in the game. This is definitely the toughest jumping platforms we've had to do so far in the game. There's also some tricks along the way that will try to fool you and end up causing you to lose a life. In this room, it's really all about taking your time, doing correct timing on your jumps to avoid accidentally falling into the pit or taking damage from the giant lines of spikes. In this room, just like we did in the previous one, jump to the moving block and then jump around it. Instead of going all the way over to the right though, instead head south to the disappearing reappearing block. In the next room we have a little bit of a puzzle. You have to actually get these giant marble-like things into the hole. You'll have to do this 2 rooms in a row in order to complete the dungeon itself. This one's a little bit tougher than the first room, but that first room of course was more of an introduction. This is definitely tricky to do the first time around, as hitting these things, you have to hit them directly in the center when they're facing you in order to make sure that they go in the direction you want them to, or you may be off a hair and they may be going left or right on a square line above or below where you wanted them to. I know that sounds confusing, but basically they end up going in a set that you don't want them to go. This definitely takes some manipulating, maneuvering, and definitely some practice, but once you're able to get through it and go through, you can exit out of the dungeon into this room. While it is a pretty short dungeon, just the overall feel of it is kind of a nice change of pace, and I think one of the bright spots in dungeon design in the game. Now here, you want to grab the chisel and then the hammer just south of it, and you'll automatically be teleported back to the mysterious figure inside the cement. After a pretty lengthy cutscene talking to Leonardo da Vinci himself, getting the katana, a brand new weapon, and having another telepathic scene with Mika, we are in Leonardo da Vinci's flying machine, something that he actually did do designs for, but of course was never actually made. But we get to ride it to 2 islands. The first island we stop at has a giant heart located inside the mountain, but that's all that's here. The first time around playing up to this point, you're probably walking around thinking, hey, what else am I supposed to do here? Eventually though, travel back to the machine itself and you'll sputter along and eventually land on the second island, and this is where we actually want it to travel to. Work your way around the forest, trees, and mountain, and enter inside the very large complex located on the mountain. Now the game ends up saving here, and we have this area. This is basically the second dungeon for this chapter. It's a very large area with lots of different paths. The path I'm going to be taking is the one that gets pretty much straight to the tetrad that we have to find. You'll also notice that I zig and zag a whole bunch, and the reason for this is there's all these holes in the floor that take you to little mini dungeons. Basically, there's about 4 or 5 or so of these little mini dungeons, and each time you fall down the hole, it picks one of those for you to do. So you may end up doing the same one 2 or 3 times, or you may get a different one each time. There's 2 of which of these holes that you have to fall into. The first one is right here. Just walk over to the right, we're going to hit the switch, and then go through the open wall at the top. You don't even have to fight the enemies or bother with anything else. Every time I've played though, I've gotten that dungeon on that hole, so I think that one's set. The same, I think, can be said for this one coming up here. You'll have a fork of 3 different paths. The only one that we want, though, is the center one, so they conveniently put the hole right in front of the center one here. But you have to do this one, since even if you want to go left or right, it's in that dead center spot and you can't avoid it. Take out the red enemy and then jump along all these giant squares, watch out for the skull, go up the staircase, and then, like I said, as soon as you exit out, don't go left or right, instead just head north. If you go left or right, you'll run into a dead end, have to backtrack, and you'll fall down that hole again. As we come up here though, we see Zoda's footprints, have to zig-zag a little bit more, but then we come to the next tetrad piece and have completed the chapter after another cutscene. Chapter number 7 is no real definitive time period that you land in, and honestly it doesn't even really give you a hint on where you're actually located. But due to the theme of everything, my guess is you're in Transylvania sometime maybe 1600s? I have no real clue. Either way, it's a haunted giant mansion that we have to travel through, so there's lots of ghoul type enemies that we're going to be facing, including the first ones, Frankenstein monsters. Yes, the monster from Frankenstein makes an appearance here in StarTropics. These guys are actually really interesting. You destroy their top portion, then the legs go crazy, running all over the place, and you have to destroy both the top and the legs themselves. Now you notice there was a path choice at the very beginning of the dungeon. Left is where we want to go, and the other 2 paths will just kind of lead in a circle. In this room, you have 4 squares that are basically the same, with ghosts that will randomly appear, and you have to destroy the purple-looking ghost in order to kill all the rest of them. The upper right corner is the purple ghost you want to destroy in order to go through the wall to the right. Next room, you have another one of their sets of enemies that can only be destroyed with the psychic wave. Following that, a new enemy. These ghost enemies can only be destroyed by hitting the tombstone that they carry on their back. I actually like these guys, they're one of my favorite enemies in this dungeon. In this room, work your way to the hole in the center, then hold any of the directional buttons you want. Hold either left and up or right and down, it doesn't matter, so you land safely on the platform and can go left to the next room. You can ignore the enemies, go to the tip of the giant arrow and fall through. Fall through the next room, or you can hold left or right in order to grab a magic jar on the left side, and you'll fall to a room with another giant arrow pointing. But we don't have to fall here. Instead, you want to go over to the right. The square located between those 4 squares in the middle is a spot that leads to a hole in the ground, so you want to jump over or just avoid that. Phew. A little bit of a breather, simple room, take out the giant ghosts with the tombstones on their back. You can avoid their projectile pretty easily. The worst thing about these guys, and another enemy we'll see later on, is because you can only hit them in their back, it may take a little bit of time. Next room, skeletons, just ignore them, go right up the staircase. Now this room, you'll see this guy who drops these explosive balls on the ground. After a few seconds, they will explode, causing not only a firework effect where they are, but projectiles to go out as well. You have a big open room to fight the first guy, but a little bit smaller with a lot of holes the second time around we fight that guy, so get used to the way he moves around. Mashing the katana right near him is definitely a way to get rid of him. After some Frankenstein monsters, we have this guy here. This wizard makes crystal balls appear on the ground, and if you attack them, they come careening towards you. So you have to either jump over them, or just avoid them altogether. After you defeat him, the next room has more of the enemies with just a psychic wave. There's also some health to pick up in the room. Going through the left will lead to a magic jar, but what you want to do is in the upper section of blocks, hit the right one and open up the door. Here, a couple of those skeletons and some bats. Bats are all you need to get rid of to open up the door, and now we face another one of those firecracker guys. Your goal, of course, is going to be to maneuver around all the holes in the floor in order to keep hitting him. I usually like to try to get him stuck in the upper left corner, keep him there, and keep attacking until he's defeated. We have the boss coming up in just a few rooms, so you want to be very careful and keep your health up. Maybe you have a magic jar, or you can actually get a little bit of health in that room previous to this. And then it's time for the boss. As soon as you enter, spikes will appear right from behind you. Then Zoda himself will appear across a large gap. Of course, you can't jump this gap to get to him, and if you accidentally try to jump while holding up at any point at the top, you will just fall down into the pit. Zoda here has two forms. The first form appears, throws a bat out, as well as a projectile. Use the katana as much as you can in order to keep doing damage to him, and after a while he'll start flashing orange and go to his second form. The second form is a giant owl hybrid. This giant winged demon will of course throw now two bats out at a time at you, and also from time to time use his giant wings in order to try to blow you back into the spike wall behind you. Along with that, feathers go flying, so you'll have to maneuver around, jump around, but be careful not to jump off the edges, and try to get around all those feathers. During the breaks in between this, run up quickly to him and deliver a few hits before he goes back into the cycle of throwing bats at you, as well as the feathers. While this is actually one of the toughest bosses in the game in my opinion, this is definitely also one of my favorite ones. After enough hits with the katana, he will flash just like all the other bosses, explode, and then we'll have a block on the right side we can walk across in order to exit out of the dungeon. Chapter 7 only has one dungeon to it, and we've already found the Tetrad, and we can now move on to chapter number 8. You appear in a forest somewhere, wondering exactly where you're located, and the music's nice and cheery with a medieval feel to it, and soon you'll come across a knight speaking the native medieval style tongue over to the left. There's another knight just above him, and over to the right here, we actually run into Sir Lancelot. That should give you a pretty good idea of where exactly we are. Walk up the mountain pass, you will see a purple soldier to your north. That's where we have to head, but first we actually have to meet King Arthur himself. Inside the kingdom, over to the right, you will actually see the Round Table. Walk continually around and you'll talk to King Arthur himself, who'll tell you about a giant dragon that's been plaguing them. But before that, he actually knights you as well. While knighting you, he also increases your health meter by 1, and of course refills it. Well, thankfully we haven't really lost any damage since we got here, so just that 1 heart. And then we exit out of the castle, go over to the Purple Knight, talk to him, who will gladly let you pass, as you are now known as Sir Mike to the kingdom. Walk along the path and into the giant mountain at the very end. Now begins the first of 2 dungeons here in Chapter 8. Now this is definitely a weird room. For the first time ever, the trigger to this room is, well, when you defeat all the enemies, you fall through the floor. Hang out at the top middle portion so that you can land on this platform here. If you land off of this platform, you'll have to walk to the room to the left, work your way back up the stairs, and then back to that slime room, defeat them again in order to fall through the floor again. Now this room works pretty much the same as the slime room earlier. You can destroy the firework guy over the skulls, even though you can't walk over them. Once he's been defeated, you'll fall through. Hang out near the top portion, you will land on spikes, lose a little bit of health. You can of course walk all the way around if you really want to, go over a few more pits and deal with some more enemies, and then take out the firework guy, but I find it easiest just to take a couple of hits of damage from the spikes and go through. Now begins a long series of rooms that have giant amounts of arrows. These arrows will push and pull you, of course, whatever direction they are. In each of the rooms you'll have giant blades that will pop out of the ground. Choosing the right direction at the first turn will allow you to go past the spikes correctly. In this one, you'll pass straight through the middle of the last 2 blades, jump over the spikes at the end. Of course, if you take your time, the spikes will form and you'll have to walk through them and take a lot of damage. Thankfully, at the very end, also, they give you a set of 4 hearts, and then it's boss time. Yep, already. The fact of usually failing your first time around and falling into the wrong parts of the floor on that first slime room and even the second one is really the key of what makes this dungeon actually long, but knowing where you're going is a really short one. This boss is definitely one of the most challenging to hit. Use your Super Psychic Wave in order to hit this guy in the center as you keep moving around all the arrows. You may from time to time have to jump, and there's a way to kind of manipulate it a little bit by timing the movements on the arrows just right. Now I think you can actually hit him with a katana, which I think would do a little bit more damage, but I always seem to mess with it, so I don't even bother. I just use the Super Psychic Wave. After defeating him, which thankfully only takes a handful of hits since he's so difficult to actually make contact with, and then we finally get the mystery of what's been up with the weird, strange animal friends we've met. So yep, the legendary wizard Merlin was the one who was behind all the animal friends who helped us out. If you end up losing all your lives in the game, instead of the island priestess that we saw in the first game, you end up actually seeing Merlin, who does the game over screen. Merlin also upgrades our wave one last time, so now we have the ultimate of the psychic waves. This of course will travel the entire length of the screen, but only lasts for pretty much the first row or so of our hearts. In the first room, we battle a couple of easy guys, and then we meet the rock golems, and like I mentioned earlier with the cactus-like guys, you have to hit them enough times, and after a few hits, they will explode, sending out a giant amount of projectile in every direction with these guys. You're going to be seeing them a lot. Giant slimes make their appearance, and these guys, when defeated, break up into 3 little slimes that you also have to hit. In this room, we have these giant dinosaur guys. These guys pack a big punch. When they pretty much make eye contact with you, they launch out a giant blast, and it covers a good amount of space, so you'll have to quickly jump over it. They repeat this over and over again, and if the blast hits you, it takes away a good amount of hearts, so you only want to get hit by maybe 1 at most during any part of this dungeon. The next room has some knight enemies for the first time. These knights, they take several hits, and every so often they will kind of do an electricity type thing and fire out a projectile at you. They aren't too difficult, but a variant of them a little bit later on is the tougher enemy of the two. After going through the door, we end up fighting two giant slimes. Just take them both out. Not too much of a pain, but the fact that they break apart can be difficult to hit. But with the new Ultra Psychic Wave, we can hit a good amount of distance in this level, so you can even hit the slime even from all the way across the room. Be sure to hit this block in case you have gotten hit a little bit so far in the dungeon to replenish some of that health. Here you have 3 of the rock golem type guys. Just like before, hit them a few times and they will explode, so be sure to jump over the explosion. Sometime I found out with a nicely timed hit to them right before they explode, it will sometimes negate the projectile that they shoot out. I'm not definitive on how exactly this works, but it seems to at least sometimes do the trick. In this room you'll have to be careful. Jump over to the moving platform, then jump up, hit the switch, and then back to the beginning of the room in order to head up, in order to get the thing that opens up the room. Over to the left side in case you need some more health, you can pick up some more hearts. In this room we're introduced to the variant of the knights I mentioned earlier, the gold knights. Now these guys I think move a little bit quicker than the gray ones. They fire out the same basic projectile, but you can only hit them from the back, just like the dark nuts from Legend of Zelda. After taking out just one, you'll move on to the next room. Here there's plenty of hearts if you want to be able to take the risk to get past the marbles moving back and forth in order to grab it. Bypassing that room, head over to the right and hit this switch that will open up the door to the right if you want a magic jar. Just north of where that is though, you can hit the next switch to actually open up the door. All throughout there, the fireworks that those one guys drop keep dropping from the ceiling and they don't stop until you're able to get through the room. Here you have 2 of the giant dinosaurs. Ignore them. Just hit the activator on the bottom part right near the door and then go through the door itself once it's open. Don't even bother fighting those 2 guys, you'll probably just end up losing a decent amount of health. After a pretty easy room with just 2 flying skulls, we then move on to a room with 2 gold knights. This is a pretty tough battle overall, but since it's a big open room, you have at least a lot of space to move around. Next room has more of those rock golems. Let's do the same thing we've been doing to them so far in the dungeon. Hit them a few times and then be prepared to jump over the projectiles they fire out. After all have been defeated, the next room contains 2 gray knights and a gold knight. Sometimes I like to focus on the gray knights first, but always if you get a free shot on the gold one, make sure that you take it. Sometimes you'll be lucky and he'll just hang out in a corner, exposing his back for you to hit him multiple times. We are nearing the very end of this dungeon, and after the next room, which has 2 giant slimes and a magic jar, we'll be fighting the boss dragon of the dungeon. The boss for this dungeon, as you already knew, was a dragon. This guy, of course, is quite large and will do a lot of damage if he runs directly into you. Behind him, spikes will slowly start to form, and yes, they will take up the entire room if you let them. To hit the boss at first, you need to jump up in the air and fire your projectile at him. Of course, you want to use the Ultra Psychic Wave on him to keep hitting him over and over again. Every so often, he'll drop his head and launch fire straight out, and then to the left and right. If you stand just a little bit to the sides, right by his feet, you'll be able to avoid the front blast and be able to hit him multiple times with his head down as he fires the other directions. He'll continue slowly walking towards you, and when he gets close, he'll open up his mouth and start flying around the room with a whole bunch of projectiles. This is the only part where I really can't hit him, and I end up losing usually a health or 2 during this part, but then he goes right back to the top of the screen and repeats the pattern over again, slowly walking towards you, once in a while firing. After he's done, you'll be out of the dungeon and can grab the last of the tetrads. After collecting all the tetrads, talking to Mika, we find out that Dr. J is in trouble and all the citizens of Sea Island are also in trouble. So we travel once again, this time to chapter number 9, the final real chapter of the game. We arrive safely at, well, Sea Island, just like it was in StarTropics 1, though the color scheme is a little bit different. When we make it to the village itself, we find that all the citizens have been transformed into warthogs. Yes, these boars are everywhere, and only one citizen remains. A guy who ended up going fishing came back, and everybody turned into a wild boar. There also seems to be some weird noises coming from the tunnel, which was the first dungeon of StarTropics 1, and we get to go down there and explore it once again. The classic music from StarTropics 1 picks up, and the dungeon is pretty much the same way it was in the first game. Well, at least for the first part of it. The enemies here, however, are basically slime enemies that we've been seeing throughout the last little bit of the game. In this room, you only have to take out a couple of them in order to make it to the next room. While putting in basically the first dungeon from the first game, they also have similar enemy placement as well. Instead of the rats from that game, you have the rats that were represented in this game. You'll also have the same thing a little bit later with the snake enemies. Instead of the rope-like enemies, you now have the giant cobra-like enemies that we've been fighting throughout the game. Here you can grab one of the sub-weapons, and I know I haven't really used the sub-weapons much in the game. A few of them are the same, but there really isn't a lot of cool ones, and like I said before early on, the main weapons that you get are just so much superior, in my opinion, than the sub-weapons. Take out the snakes and a couple of slimes, and make sure you open up the pass so that you can continue north. Here you'll have to battle a couple of bats as well as a cobra. You only have to take out the bats though to open up the door. And then it's time to rematch the first boss from StarTropics 1. However, since we defeated him and turned him into bone in the first game, he's now reformed as a giant skeleton dragon here. This giant bone snake will immediately start opening his mouth just like before, which is the only time you can hit him, and he will fire out a giant amount of projectiles. And when he does this, you want to stand to the left or right, or even on one of the other islands, to avoid those projectiles. Keep hitting him with the Ultra Psychic Wave in order to do enough damage to defeat him, and then move on the platform and jump behind him. However, instead of ending the dungeon, we move on to another part of it. The first part has us actually moving along the arrow paths that we've seen before, collecting health as well as magic jars. This is basically a way to prepare you for the upcoming end of the game, because instead of just going one-on-one with the final boss, you have to rematch most of the bosses from the game itself. So here I grab 4 magic jars as well as I have plenty of health, barely get over the spikes at the end, and then go through this room. We immediately fall through the floor to a black and white-like area, and it's time for the rematch. A little bit of ominous sound appears, and then we can hit the switches, and we go into our rematch against Yum Yum. Like I said, we'd be facing this guy again later on, and I was right. This guy is quite angry when we first start off with him, but his pattern's basically the same. He'll just move back and forth, firing at bubbles every time he opens his mouth. At least in this rematch, you got a chance to see what this guy can actually do, instead of defeating him before he's able to even get a move off. There's no break for you, though, in between the bosses. You go right to the next boss when you enter the next room. Here we face the giant scorpion again. Since we have the super ultra psychic wave now, though, we do a lot more damage to the bosses. We can hit them from a farther distance away, so we don't have to get in close. And we already know their patterns, so we have a huge advantage. It's really cool, and I actually do like doing boss rushes in games, but this boss rush ends up being a lot easier than the first time you face these guys. The next boss is the giant pharaoh head that we battled in the second dungeon of Egypt. Just like before, we want to avoid the giant blast that he fires out when he changes heads, and the other small projectiles he shoots out normally. After you do enough damage and defeat him, you'll fall through the floor and land right into the London Baker Street boss of Zoda X. This boss still is relatively difficult because it's hard to hit him. Any boss like that is tough even in the rematches. There's a few areas, like this area right here, I can kind of get stuck between the arrows, and I got lucky enough that he actually appeared on the left side, allowing me to hit him with the shots from a far distance. Though he does throw out the firewall and block a few of them. Remember to try to conserve some of your health, but thankfully, not only did we have full health going in, we were able to pick up 4 jars. Now the jars aren't an instant full health, but they do help you a little bit, and there's one other health item we will get before the actual final boss of the game. Next up, we battle the miner from the second dungeon of the Wild West chapter. We don't have to actually battle that first guy again. Just try to do your best to avoid the rocks as they're rolling around, but like I said, since you have that psychic wave, you can hit them from a farther distance and avoid most of the rocks. Though you will have to maneuver around a little bit in case the rocks end up getting in your way, blocking your shots. After that, we move to the rematch against Zoda Y and the giant owl weird hybrid alien thing. I stand on the edge and I'm able to keep blasting them, this time instead of using the katana, using the psychic wave, but the boss battle strategy remains the same, though I can hit him from a little bit farther away this time. The second form remains exactly the same as it was the first time. Keep firing at him at the very beginning, he'll bounce around, launch some bats at you which will go down in a single shot, and after a little bit, he'll start flapping his wings and you'll have to run around the room. Just try to do your best to stay north of the spikes and don't accidentally jump into the giant pits. After he's done, we don't get to actually rematch the moving night boss from the giant arrow room. Instead, we go right to the giant dragon boss. Keep doing the jumps up into the air and firing at him as the spikes slowly form in the background. And when he eventually gets down far enough, he will, of course, fly around the room, firing out all the little projectiles. Like I said before, also, if you time it right, and if you're able to get in front of him, just left or right of his head, and right in front of the legs, at the exact right spot, you can avoid the fireballs from him directly from the mouth, and keep hitting him as he just lowers his head and fires left and right. I always liked, as a kid, trying to beat the bosses faster and faster, and with that one, I always tried to see how quickly I could beat him before the spikes ended up showing up on the floor, seeing how many rows of them formed before I was actually able to defeat him. In the next room, it's now time for the final boss of the game. Hit both switches, one to open the door, and one to get one of those power pills. Now, we saw them at the end of StarTropics 1, and this is the only one that actually appears in this game, but it refills all our health. It's now time for the actual final boss. It starts off with the little aliens moving all around. Like with the ghost earlier on in the game, you have to only attack one of them, and only one of them can be hit, in order to actually be hurt. Once he's destroyed, the rest form Zoda Z. He then starts flying around the room and he has 2 different attacks. He has a normal projectile attack and he also has a giant ball attack. If the giant spheres hit you, they turn you into a warthog. You then are stuck as a warthog for a short period of time and cannot attack. You just have to run around and avoid. After enough hits, he'll switch to his final form. This guy is a big hawking monster. He fires out projectiles a lot quicker, as well as he will fire out the giant spheres that turn you into a boar. Besides that, he also has 2 new moves. He'll either crash the ground itself, causing a shockwave to come out, or he'll summon lightning from the ceiling, which will crash down, cause a giant explosion effect, like the fireworks that we saw drop by the enemies earlier on in the game. Just be careful that when he drops down his fist to hit the ground, you're not standing right behind him or right in front of him that same line, so the fire runs into you. After enough damage to him, though, he will explode magnificently, and then we can safely exit out of the dungeon and start the ending to StarTropics 2: Zoda's Revenge. Just like the end of StarTropics 1, is a little bit of an interactive ending here. After talking to Mika and all, walk a little bit left and you'll end up outside of the tunnel back where we entered it. You can actually walk around the first town again and talk to all the citizens, some of which say the same things they did in the first game, and other ones reference the stuff they said in the first one. When you're done talking to everybody, enter the village chief's hut, talk to the village chief, and sit back and enjoy the ending to StarTropics 2. So there you have StarTropics 2 Zoda's Revenge. The credits play out nicely on the Oxford Wonder World, as you have the credits on the right pages, and on the left one pictures of the adventure itself, similar to showing the pictures at the end of StarTropics 1 of all the different places and things we got to do during the game. Overall, I think for many people, the nostalgia of StarTropics 2 just isn't as high as the original game. Since many didn't play it as kids when they played the original game and didn't play it till years later, it doesn't have the same impact. For me though, I got the game actually not too long after it was released. After having such amazing memories of StarTropics 1, I begged my uncle to buy me StarTropics 2 when we were one day just walking around an electronics store. I'll never forget rushing home and playing it for hours on end, getting stuck for the first real time at the Leonardo da Vinci level. I feel there are a lot of really cool moments in this game, and I kind of pointed some of those out, whether it was the Leonardo da Vinci dungeon itself, the cactus dance, meeting all the cool characters like Sherlock Holmes and King Arthur, and even though it changed the settings, it did change the gameplay. I think overall it still stands as a great NES title. Maybe not as good as the original StarTropics, and maybe the game lost some of what made that game fantastic. But as a standalone title, I think this game is actually able to be picked up by more people and immediately enjoyed because of the little bit laxation in the controls. Look, like most people, I love the original one more. I have many more memories attached to it, but I have a lot of memories with this one too. I really wish they would make a StarTropics 3, revive the series. I wish someone like a Retro Studios would be the ones who actually did it, or at least someone who loved or played the original games and understood what made them great. There was so many cool possibilities they could have done with StarTropics and different storylines. I always thought it would have been pretty cool to have a game years later where Mike's a little bit more grown up, travels to the Argonian homeworld after it's been rebuilt, saves Mika once again, and you could have had a marriage at the end. I mean, we saved Mika, we saved her father, and why not have something cool like a marriage at the end of it? And of course, there's a ton of other storyline possibilities you could have gone with it. I love both StarTropics games, there's no doubt about it. It's one of my favorite series, I have so many memories, and that both of which will always have a special place in my heart. And with that, that's going to wrap up this edition of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.